Who's Afraid of Ideology? Part 3, Micro-Resistances, is the latest film by Berlin-based Lebanese artist Marwa Arsanios. Her first appearance at IFFR was in 2013 with the short film I've Heard Stories, Part 1. Who is Afraid of Ideology, Part 3, the installation version of which was presented at the Berlin Biennale, has its World Festival premiere at IFFR.
Hi, Marwa. It's really a pleasure to be in conversation with you about this beautiful and multi-layered film. So your recent work has taken you to so many countries across the world. I wondered how you came to be interested in Colombia and this specific community.
Hi, Natasha, and also pleasure to be in conversation with you again. I would like to start by just giving a little brief introduction about the whole project and also how everything started. So this particular film is a third chapter in a series of film, Who is Afraid of Ideology? And it's the third part, actually. And in fact, I started back in 2017 when I met the two women from the autonomous women's movement, the Kurdish autonomous women's movement. We translated one of the texts of Pelcin, who is a guerrilla fighter. In fact, she's also a writer and sort of like an ideologue of the movement. And she's writing mostly about the connection between the ecological and feminist paradigms in the movement. And it all comes from her own experience as a guerrilla fighter and as someone who is living in the mountains. And who also has to confront on a daily life. She confronts the fact that she lives in a landscape that she's fighting for. And so this text was crucial for, the beginning of my thinking about the intersection of the ecological and feminist paradigms and political connection between these two paradigms, and how they cannot be divided, or they come hand in hand. After doing the first two parts of the films that were, coming out of this beautiful text by Pelcin, I organized in June 2019 a convention of ecological feminists and women farmers in Warsaw during the Warsaw Biennial. Or it was like in the frame of, I was invited to the Warsaw Biennial, and then I decided to organize this convention, where I invited women from the autonomous women's movement and other women that are working within like communes and cooperatives or movement, or are part of movements, or are part of organizations that are all thinking about questions of land and question of how to communalize land, and how to also take out or move from private property to communal properties. And so this was a really also another crucial moment where all these women had met, and I have also met them, and we were trying to find sort of a way to build a kind of alliances between all these different movements and communes, cooperatives, etc. And this is when I invited Grupo Semillas to come to the convention, and also together with Mercy Vera, who was leader, like a social leader and a farmer from the Pihao community. So this was like the first time when also I had met them, and I had the chance to physically meet and discuss all these questions. And it was quite, immediately it was very striking the way all these different women coming from all the completely different geographical backgrounds had a sort of a very similar politics, and even in the discourse, the way they were talking about their struggle was so similar, despite the very disparate geographies and contexts and political conditions as well. But there was a very clear idea, of course, about this, moving from a private property, or how to reappropriate land. So there was a very clear idea about, the purpose and the drive of the struggle. So to take back a land that was that they were dispossessed from. But also at the same time, there was also very similar strategies. So questions of, for example, the seeds, and forming small seed banks, the relationship to agriculture, new agricultural ways of thinking that are ancient, but countering sort of industrial agriculture. So I think that they had very similar strategies in tackling this question also. And so this is where the whole, the third part of the film, or the third chapter of the series of film started.
Okay. And so what was it particularly about the group from Colombia that made them the subject for the third film, from this whole kind of community that you drew together in Warsaw?
Yeah, well, obviously during this convention, I had the time, long time to talk to Mercy and also to Claudina, who I had invited to another workshop, not to the convention. In fact, it was quite striking the way Mercy was narrating to me the whole day-to-day struggle in relation to the smallest and tiniest entities. So it was very revealing to me that someone who is trying to fight to preserve or to protect, a seed that is their survival strategy, basically, becomes a threat to multinationals and to the state and to corporations and, to so many, and all their security and military apparatuses. So, and even legal in relation to, the copyright or intellectual property of the seed. In fact, that was for me such a striking story to tell. And also the fact that you can actually be killed, or your life is at threat because you are protecting or trying to protect that very, very small entity. And at the same time you are trying to protect yourself. So and also this entanglement of survival between the survival of the entity is so linked to the survival of the people and the person who is trying to fight for it, and also in relation to land. So this, for me, this kind of connections and sort of like very clear fact that we can only survive if these other entities that are like non-human entities also survive. And our survival is linked to them. And at the same time that you become such a threat, and that this little small thing becomes such a threat to, like these big apparatuses. So all of these questions were so striking to me that I wanted to go and at least as a first step, visit them there and see, what really feel and sort of like see with my own eyes what the materiality and the material conditions of the struggles are.
Yeah, so how did the structure for the film develop, and how long did you spend out there with each community?
We didn't have a lot of time, unfortunately. I went there, it was like my last, work trip, or like a kind of a research trip. I went there in February, but we had to be back very soon. And when I came back, it was already lockdown. So we didn't spend a lot of time. We went by maybe like 2 weeks only we had there. And I was planning to go again, but of course this will not happen, or did not happen last year at least. It was, I mean, the thing is that we had like very, very long conversations all through the way. Since like we met in Warsaw and then met again for the smaller workshop, so there was like a ongoing, and there still is like an ongoing conversation. So I think this is like what sort of like helped me or guided the structure of the film. And you will see that in the film, as you saw, or you already saw in the film, there is like a different layers and different languages. And this is also like part of the conversation. This is how the conversation was going as well. So, there is like a part that is more like a storytelling, and there is a part that is more maybe like more straightforward interviews, and there is a part with my own voiceover that is we can say a little bit more I don't know, meta level or something. So I think that also during the convention when we met, there was like all these different languages and all these different discourses that came together. And in fact, also like people, the women that were participating in the convention were coming from different backgrounds. So there was lawyers, and there was theoreticians, and there was, people who had actual farms, and people who were coming from, certain political movements and had like a more, direct political language. So there was like all of these different let's say discourses or languages. And I think this translates in the film as well. And it really comes from, like these different ways of telling, what is happening, or at the same time, you need a certain language to perhaps like mourn and grieve what is lost. And at the same time, you need also another language to speak about also a certain continuity in the struggle and a certain, day-to-day, struggle and way to survive, or ways and strategies to survive. And also you need maybe a third language, or something that is also thinking about all these different or like the connections between these different languages, and what brings them together, and think maybe more on an a more abstract level. So I think that this is, that's that was the way we sort of conceived about the structure also, or that guided the structure of the film.
Yeah, because the film opens with this sequence of projected images of microbes onto a sort of lens-like structure that holds seeds, and you hear this tic-tac of them falling onto the glass. And it's a very kind of sculptural assemblage, and given that you're an exhibiting artist, it sort of makes a lot of sense that you're using that language. And just then when you're talking about this third language or third space for the kind of abstract, that really kind of strikes a note with that opening sequence that reappears later in the film. Why was it important for you to create that kind of structure, and what were the choices going on there?
Yeah, so in fact, this set was made by Vinita Gatne. She's a brilliant artist and set designer with whom I worked. And in fact, it was before I went to, before like the whole trip, and before like we weren't even like thinking about the structure of the film yet. I mean, I knew I was going to do a film, but we weren't really thinking about the structure. I already had this part in mind, that this needs to be, there is like a set or something that is a constructed world, or like artificial world that is constructed, that needs to be one part of the film. I didn't know yet where it was going to be, if it was going to be, and I didn't have like the full script yet. So, but I had like this idea already that it's so important to, bring in the artificiality, or like this constructed into, like all the other landscape shots, and a much more like a direct, let's say, documentary approaches. And so I think that it's also like, this is a moment when I was thinking about this question of, what visual regimes am I using in these films? Because I'm like, I never did like, or never used, let's call it like this, like I never used documentary approaches before these three films, before like the Who is Afraid of Ideology series. And it was really striking for me, or like the subject matter was asking for it somehow. So it was asking for a more documentary approach. And so in the third chapter, I thought that, okay, I need to rethink that language that I used in, the first two parts. I really need to rethink why I used it, and why I felt that there was a need to go into this like more direct, or like more straightforward documentary approaches. And this is when I was also thinking about the question of like nature, and question of like landscape shots, and how I can juxtapose a more constructed artificial sort of like visual regime, or like in this case the set, juxtapose it with images that are much more direct, like directly, or more like directly and sensually dealing with the landscape. So there I was really thinking about that, but also I was thinking about the like a very macro perspective of these landscapes, and also how you zoom into the micro, and how do you actually film this micro, this small entity. So it was very much like a question of, what visual regime or regimes one needs to step into to talk about these subjects. And I feel that I'm still, thinking about this question, and I'm still like, it's really unresolved for me, because in the previous films that I have done, there is always a kind of a staging and the performance and the performative aspect, and that was like the mediation. So either like a reenactment, or I don't know, like in different films, it's I used different mediation. But I think here there was like this more, as I said, like this more like documentary approaches, and it's still for me unresolved. What visual regimes do you use to talk about these subjects? And so I think that it's something that I'm still thinking about.
Because there are still elements within this film that sort of foreground the regime of the documentary. There are shots of like your tripod, there are shots where people are being mic'd up or directed to scatter seeds at a certain rate, and you yourself appear in some of the shots as well. So what were the choices behind having those kinds of images in the film?
Yeah, I think this is always a part of the, the production of the image is always part of the, like the image. And so I think that I'm always thinking about this question. That's like also a main question for me, that the editing process and the filming process and the production of the whole film need to be transparent, or need to come through in the film and are part of it. So and it's very important also to sort of position myself as the one that is filming, or as the one that is directing, to position myself in relation to like the subject matter, and also in relation to all the movement, in particular because there's like these political movement and organizations. It's important to also see me as one that is, coming also a little bit from outside, and trying to learn from these movements, and trying to learn from these strategies.
What was your feeling of responsibility towards telling Mariana's very tragic story?
Yeah, well, it's a story that has been told to me, and I was like on an affectual level, I was very affected by it, and it was like the driving, the drive of the whole film. And literally it's in like it comes where there is like a driving shots. I mean, it was really like the sort of the thread, or like the driving thread, and why I wanted also to make this film. I felt that in the last two parts, it was like the part 1 and part 2 of Who's Afraid of Ideology. I never really talked about that fact, the fact that there is something that is really lost, or like there is something that I always, or like the conversation always went in a direction where we're like talking about the struggle, and talking about a sort of almost like a heroism of the struggle, and not showing this kind of like loss, and sort of like also the idea that something needs to be or something is always lost in these struggles, and something needs to be also like mourned in order to be able to continue. Or like the only way to continue, and the only way that these struggles go on is by mourning as well. So mourning is part of it, and I felt that it was like I had to really like come to terms with the fact that mourning these people that you don't even know actually, is a basic necessity to think about any sort of construction of a ecological or feminist paradigm. Or so I think that this was quite crucial.
Yeah. And mourning relates to memory, which is a really important part of this film as well, memorialization. There's beautiful kind of poetic moments in which the women are discussing accumulation, preserving these seeds by replanting and safeguarding so that other generations will have access to them. And there's a scene in which a woman is sharing songs with you that she's written in order to try and transmit knowledge. And there's discussion around the importance of memory of the those who have fought for indigenous rights previously. Is that a role that you see for film in general as a medium, and for this film particularly?
I think that it's really important to think about, like the use of, or like what can film do, and of course what can also its limits as well. But also an important thing is to think about how can we not contribute to this, really, like, I don't know, accident or catastrophe or like tragedies. So I think that these questions always come up when you are making a film. What it can do, its limits, and how can you not reproduce as well. And you always fall into something. You always think that you have more capacity than you do, or like you always like reproduce something than, and it's really like the contradiction. You're like really, you delve into the contradictions of making and producing images. And I think that the fact that you're like already like making, you're already like thinking about what this can do, and you have some kind of belief that it can do something. And for me, what is really interesting is rather than like maybe going into question of memory and making memorials, thinking about the way they are thinking about seeds. So thinking about how these seeds won't be like, preserved or conserved or accumulated, or because memory can also become a kind of a cultural capital that you sort of accumulate. So maybe think about also films in that way, or filmmaking in that way, where you're like trying to tackle these questions without really going into making out of them like a memorial, or like something that is like static, or something that is, but rather leave the openness and leave them open, and think more about like the question of maybe history, and how we can actually, through these very small, humble interventions, intervene in a sort of a rethinking of history, rewriting of history, and also think about maybe like a new ways of actually producing, or hopefully producing, a new like a systemic change. So I think that maybe if we could think about them as these kinds of like interventions in historical moment, that could maybe perhaps change something.
Obviously, Mariana's story was a really tragic one, and there is a sense of kind of simmering violence or suppression within the region. when you were on the ground, was there ever a sense in which people didn't want a story to be told? And is that the relevance of the scene at the end where the woman's voice is interrupted by this helicopter sound?
Yeah, I mean, there is a question of what you can tell and what you cannot tell. So maybe there is like more, like maybe more tragic stories and stories that are also like a, I don't know, that are hidden and that, you know, they don't want them to be told. But I think that because this story is already like quite in the past, it's talked about, and it's like really, and other stories like that also are talked about more comfortably, and there is no like like there is no impetus to hide it or to try to conceal it or omit it. At the contrary. But the thing is that maybe there are other stories that are more urgent, like, for example, stories of plantations, stories of land grabbing, stories of corporations that are building, I don't know, like fish farms, stories of, and this is like particularly coming from like North American corporations that grab land and then build like these huge fish farms to be like fish to be exported. So I think that it might be also like these stories are more dangerous and threatening now to be told, and these, for example, are not as they're not as spoken about, or they're not like comfortably spoken about. So you can sense when the stories can be told and stories cannot be told. And of course, this is part of the responsibility of making, like a story or telling a story, is to know also what, can be told or not. Or.
And a final question, perhaps. Do you share the films with the community as they're being made or as they're finalized? And is there a sense of a kind of feedback loop or impact that the resolved film has for them?
Yeah, well, most of the time I'm sharing the films when they are almost done, because I'm also like not very comfortable sharing them when they're like in a very weird shape, or like the different like shapes they go through. But so and it's often, I've often had like or indifferent or nice feedback, but so I do like share it, and but there is no like direct input or as long as there is no like how do you say refusal. There hasn't been like any kind of obvious refusal or like a request to remove something, or but I share it usually for this reason: if there is like some kind of objection or a request to remove something, or but in fact there is no like it's not like a how do you say collective it's not a collective process in that sense.
Well, thank you so much for discussing the films with me today. It's such a incredible body of work and such kind of dedicated piece of research that synthesized so many sort of vital issues facing us as a humanity today. So thank you very much for that, Marwa.
Thank you, Natasha. Thank you very much for being in conversation, for your great questions. Thank you.